Welcome to Reading with Nana, and hello to my returning friends. As we started last week, we're reading the novel called Heidi, and the author or the writer is Johanna Spiri. Now, last week, we began our story. We find out our main character, Heidi, is an orphan. Both of her parents have died, and she's lived with her aunt for like the past 5 years. So she's 5 years old. She lives in a little village um, near the Swiss Alps. That's a large mountain range in Switzerland, and they're not far from Frankfurt, Germany. So the story kind of goes back and forth from her little village to Frankfurt. At this point, her aunt, Detta, has gotten a job offer and she's decided to take it, which means Heidi has to go someplace else. Well, Heidi is going to her grandfather's home, who is known as Uncle. He's not everyone's uncle, but in the village they're somehow related. So, where we left off, she is greeting her grandfather. Good evening, grandfather. Well, well, well. What does that mean? Replied the old man in a rough voice, giving her his hand only for a moment. He watched her with a long and penetrating look from under his bushy brows. Heidi gazed back at him without a blink of the eye. She examined him with much curiosity, for he was a strange sight indeed, with his thick gray beard and shaggy eyebrows that met in the middle like a thicket of brush. By this time, Heidi's aunt had arrived with Peter, who was eager to see what was going to happen. Good day to you, uncle, said Data, as she approached. This is Tobias's and Adelaide's child. Tobias, remember, is grandfather's son. You would not recognize her because the last time you saw her, she was scarcely a year old. Why do you bring her here? Asked the uncle. Turning to Peter, he said irritably, Get away and bring my goats. How late you have come now. Peter obeyed and quickly disappeared. The uncle looked after him as though he was glad to see him go. Uncle, I have brought the little girl for you to keep, said Detta. I have done my share to care for her these last 4 years, and now it is your turn to provide for her. The old man's eyes flamed with anger. Indeed, he said. What on earth shall I do when she begins to whine and cry for you? Small children always do this, and then I will be helpless. You'll have to figure it out yourself, Data resorted. When the little baby was left in my hands a few years ago, I had to learn how to care for the little innocent myself, and nobody told me anything. I already had to care for my mother, and there was plenty of me to do. You can't blame me if I want to earn some money for myself now. If she comes to harm, though, you will be responsible, and I am sure you do not want that burden on your conscience anymore. In her excitement, Detta had said more than she'd intended, for her conscience was not quite clear about leaving the child. The uncle had risen during her last words, and now he gave her such a look that she retreated a few steps. Stretching out his arm in a commanding gesture, he said, Away with you! Begone! Go back to wherever you have come from, and do not venture here again. Detta did not have to be told twice. She said goodbye to Heidi and farewell to Uncle, and started back down the mountain. Like a steam engine, her excitement drove her forward, and she continued running down to the village at a tremendous rate. When she reached the village, a great many people called on her because they were all wondering where she had left the child. They were well acquainted with both grandfather and the child. When she heard people calling from door and windows, Where is the child? Where have you left her? Where is the child, Detta? Where have you left her? Each time she answered with more hesitation in her voice. Up with the uncle. With the uncle. Then she became much provoked when the women would say to her, How could you do that? That poor little creature. The idea of leaving such a helpless child up there, and over and over and over again. The poor little dear. Detta ran quickly as she could. She was relieved when she heard no more calls, because to tell the truth, she herself was uneasy. The child's mother had asked her on her deathbed to care for Heidi, but she consoled herself with the thought that she would be able to do more for the child if she could earn some money. She was very glad to go away from people who interfered in her affairs and looked forward with great delight to her new place. Chapter 2, with the grandfather. After Detta had disappeared, the uncle sat down again on the bench, blowing big clouds of smoke out his pipe. He did not speak, but kept his eyes fastened on the ground. In the meantime, Heidi was looking about her surroundings. Soon she discovered the goat shed and peeked in, but nothing could be seen inside. Searching for more interesting sights, she came upon 3 old fir trees behind the hut. The wind was roaring through the branches, and the tops of the trees were swaying to and fro. Heidi stood still, listening. After the wind had ceased somewhat, she walked around the hut, back to see grandfather. There she found him in exactly the same position she had left him. Planting herself squarely in front of the old man, with arms folded behind her back, she gazed at him. Looking up, the grandfather saw the child standing motionless in front of him. "What do you want to do now?" he asked her. "I want to see what's in the hut," replied Heidi. "Come then." And with that, the grandfather got up and entered the cottage. "Take your things along," he commanded. "I don't want them anymore," answered Heidi. The old man turned about and threw a penetrating glance in her direction. The child's dark eyes were sparkling with expectation of all the things that were waiting for her to see. "She is not lacking in intelligence," he muttered to himself. Speaking louder, he said, "And why don't you need them anymore?" "I want to go about like the light-footed goats." "All right, you can, but take the things and we'll put them in the cupboard." The child obeyed. The old man now opened the door, and Heidi followed him into a fairly spacious room, which took in an entire expanse of the hut. In one corner stood a table and a chair, and in another the grandfather's bed. Across the room, a large kettle was suspended over the hearth, and opposite to it a large door was sunk into the wall. This grandfather opened. It was the cupboard in which all his clothes were kept. On one shelf were a few shirts, socks, and towels, and on another a few plates, cups, and glasses. And on the top shelf, Heidi could see a round loaf of bread and some bacon and cheese. In this cupboard, the grandfather kept everything that he needed for his subsistence. When he opened it, Heidi pushed her things far behind the grandfather's clothes as she could reach. She did not want them to be easily found any time in the near future. After looking around attentively in the room, she asked, "Where am I going to sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you want to," he replied. That suited Heidi exactly. She peeped into all the corners of the room and looked into every little nook to find a cozy place to sleep. Beside the old man's bed was a ladder, which she promptly climbed and arrived in the hayloft above. It was filled with fresh and fragrant hay. Through a tiny round window, she could look far down into the valley. "I want to sleep up here," Heidi called down. "Oh, it is lovely here. Please come up, grandfather, and see it for yourself." "I know it," a voice sounded from below. "I'm making my bed now," the little girl called out again, while she carefully arranged the hay. "Oh, do come up and bring a sheet, grandfather. Every bed must have a sheet." "Is that so?" said the old man. He opened the cupboard and began rummaging around in it. At last he pulled out a long, coarse cloth from under the shirts. It somewhat resembled a sheet, and it was carried up into the loft where a neat little bed had been prepared. The hay was arranged such that the head of the occupant would lie exactly opposite the window. The grandfather stacked more hay under the bed so as to provide more cushion from the hard floor below. Then together they put the heavy sheet over the hay, tucking the ends in tightly. Heidi looked thoughtfully at her fresh new bed and said, "Grandfather, we have forgotten something." "What?" he asked. "I have no cover. When I go to bed, I always crawl in between the sheet and the cover." "What shall we do if we don't have any?" asked the grandfather. "Never mind. I'll just take some more hay to cover me," Heidi reassured him. And she was about to heap more hay over the sheet when the old man stopped her. "Just wait 1 minute," he said. And then he went down to his own bed. He removed a large, heavy linen bag, which he brought to the child. "Isn't this better than hay?" he asked. Heidi pulled the sack to and fro with all her might, but she could not unfold it, for it was too heavy for her little arms. So the grandfather placed the thick cover on the bed while Heidi watched him. After all was done, she said, "What a nice bed I have now, and what a splendid cover. I only wish the evening was here now so that I could go to sleep." "I think that we might eat something first," said the grandfather. "Don't you think so?" Heidi had forgotten everything else as she was preparing the bed, but now that she was reminded of her dinner, she realized how terribly hungry she really was, for she had had only a single piece of bread and a cup of thin coffee very early in the morning before her long journey. Heidi said approvingly, "I think we might, grandfather." "Let's go down then and prepare dinner if we agree," said the old man, and he followed close behind her as she climbed down the ladder. When he had reached the fireplace, he pushed the big kettle aside and reached for a smaller one that was suspended on a chain. Then, sitting down on a three-legged stool, he kindled a warm and glowing fire. When the kettle began to boil, the old man put a large piece of cheese on it, a long iron fork, and held it over the fire, turning it to and fro until it was golden brown on all sides. Heidi was watching him eagerly, and then suddenly she ran to the cupboard. By the time grandfather brought the pot and the toasted cheese to the table, he had found it already nicely set, with two plates and two knives and the bread in the middle. Heidi had seen these things in the cupboard earlier, and she knew that these things would be needed for the meal. "I am glad that you can think for yourself," said the grandfather while he put the cheese on top of the bread. "But there is still something we need for the dinner." Heidi saw the steaming pot and ran back to the cupboard in all haste. All she could find was a single little bowl on the shelf, but that did not stop Heidi. She retrieved the bowl and two glasses sitting in the cupboard. With those three things in tow, she returned to the table. "You certainly can help yourself, but where shall you sit?" asked the grandfather, who occupied the only chair at the table. Heidi flew to the hearth and came back with a little stool, which she sat down. "Now you have a seat, but it is much too low, and you are too little to reach the table from my chair. But now you shall have something to eat." And with that, the grandfather filled the little bowl with milk. Placing it on his chair, he moved it as near to the stool as possible. So there Heidi had a table for herself. He told her to eat the large piece of bread and the slice of golden cheese. Then he sat down himself on a corner of the table and started his own dinner. Heidi drank the milk without stopping, for she was exceedingly thirsty after her long journey. Taking a long breath, "Whew," she put down her little bowl. "How do you like the milk?" the grandfather asked her. "I never tasted better," answered Heidi. "Then you shall have more." And with that, the grandfather filled the little bowl once more. The little girl ate and drank with the greatest enthusiasm. After she was done with dinner, they both went down to the goat shed. Here the old man busied himself, and Heidi watched him attentively as he swept out the stalls and put down fresh straw for the goats to sleep on. Then he went into the little shop next to the shed and fashioned a tall chair for Heidi, to the little girl's greatest joy and amazement. Grandfather made her a chair. "What is this I am making now?" asked the grandfather. "This is a chair for me. I am sure of it because it is so tall. How quickly it was made," said the child, full of admiration and wonder. "This little one surely knows what is what, and she has eyes in the right place," the grandfather said to himself while he walked around the hut, fastening a nail on a loose board here and there. He wandered about with his hammer and nails, busily repairing whatever was in need of fixing. Heidi followed him everywhere and watched the work with great excitement and close attention. At last the evening came. The old fir trees were rustling, and a mighty wind was roaring and howling through the treetops. These sounds just thrilled Heidi's heart and filled her with happiness and joy. She danced and jumped about under the trees, for those sounds made her feel as if a wonderful thing had happened to her. The grandfather was standing under the door watching her when suddenly a shrill whistle came from the mountain trail. Heidi stood and looked around while grandfather joined her outside. Down from the mountain heights came one goat and then another and another, with Peter walking in their midst. With a shrill cry of joy, Heidi ran into the middle of the herd, greeting her old friends. When they had all reached the hut, two beautiful, slender goats emerged from the herd, one of them white and the other brown. They came up to the grandfather, who held out some salt in his hands for them, as he did every night. Heidi tenderly caressed the first one and then the other, almost beside herself with joy. "Are they ours, grandfather? Do they both belong to us? Are they going to the stable? Are they going to stay with us?" Heidi kept on asking in her excitement. The grandfather could hardly answer with a yes, yes, surely, as she continued with so many questions. When the goats had licked up all the salt, the old man said, "Go in, Heidi, and fetch your bowl and the bread." Heidi obeyed and returned right away. The grandfather filled the bowl with milk from the white goat. Then he cut a slice of bread for the child and told her to eat. "After you have done eating, you can go to bed. If you need some shirts and other linen, you will find them in the bottom of the cupboard. Aunt Detta left a bundle for you. Now, good night. I have to look after the goats and lock them up for the night." "Good night, grandfather." "Oh, please tell me their names," called Heidi after him. "The white one's name is Schwalanli, and the brown one I call Barley," he answered. "Good night, Schwanli." "Good night, Barley," the little girl called loudly as they disappeared into the shed. Heidi sat down on the bench and finished her supper. The wind was blowing so hard it nearly blew her from her seat. So she hurried with her meal and went back inside and climbed up into her bed. That night she slept on her bed of hay as well as a prince might sleep on his royal couch. Soon after Heidi had gone up to bed, before it was quite dark, the old man retired to his bed. He was always up in the morning with the sun, which rose early over the mountainside during the long summer days. It was a wild and stormy night. Long into the evening, the hut shook in the gusts and the wallboards creaked. The wind howled through the chimney, and the old fir trees shook so strongly that many a dead branch came crashing down. In the middle of the night, the grandfather rose up, saying to himself, "I am sure she must be afraid." Climbing up the ladder, he crept over to Heidi's bed. At first, everything lay in darkness, but then the moon came out behind the clouds and sent a brilliant light across Heidi's bed. Her cheeks were burning red, and her head rested peacefully against her round, chubby arms. She must have been dreaming a happy dream, for she was smiling in her sleep. The grandfather stood and watched her until a cloud drifted over the moon and the scene faded into complete darkness. Then he climbed back down and returned to his own bed. I hope you enjoy this reading. Grandfather, who's been described as a mean and grumpy and angry man. Is that what we saw in his interaction with Heidi? What do you begin to think about him? Click like or subscribe. Until next time, we will start with chapter 3 on the pasture.